Hello, and welcome back to the very last session of Esther. Before I get started, I want to say too that if anybody's watching this and they want to send me an email or a message of some kind to let me know what would interest them, what part of the Bible or what character or what book of the Bible you might be interested in listening to, I'm not exactly sure where I'm going next, but I'm not giving up because we're still social distancing and I'm still stuck at home a lot. And I think it's great that we're meeting this way. So I'm going to keep going, but I'm just not exactly sure where I'm going to go. So if you have a suggestion, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a text. I'm probably going to take one day off, just thinking about it, praying about it, deciding where to go next. So you have a day to kind of let me know. So we were in Esther 9 yesterday, or the last session, and at that point, we know the Jews obtained their victory. The people in the rural areas, they had their victory on the 14th, and the people in the capital city of Susa, they fought on the 13th and 14th and had their day of celebration on the 15th. So Mordecai has decided to set aside the 14th and the 15th days of Adar, the month in the Jewish calendar, which corresponds to our late February, early March, depending on how the calendar works out. He decided that he would ask all the people to set aside those 2 days to be celebration days so that this whole victory through God would be remembered. And he also writes it all down. And that's another way that we can pass along our knowledge to other people. So this is starting in verse 20 of chapter 9. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness, by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and when their sorrow turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. So Mordecai wrote this all down and sent letters to everybody all through the whole provinces and asking them not just to celebrate this year, but to make it an annual event. And how were they to celebrate it? By food and celebration and joy and gladness and giving gifts to each other and also giving money to the poor. We do that very same thing on Christmas, don't we? That's a time when most of us are thinking of the gift that God gave us in Jesus, and we want to give to other people. So we donate to the poor, we give gifts to each other as a symbol of love. And so this is what Mordecai wanted the people to do, and he wanted them to pass that tradition along to generations so that this huge victory and this wonderful way that God had intervened behind the scenes and brought everything together and delivered them, that would not be forgotten. So that is his purpose here. And it says, so the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. And these lots were called Purim. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire. And Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. That is why this celebration is called Purim, because it is the ancient word for casting lots. Perhaps you have heard of the celebration of Purim. It is still celebrated by Jews to recall the events when Queen Esther and Mordecai were able to save the Jews from annihilation. And it is a 2-day festival where people celebrate. They have certain foods that they usually have at that time, and they give gifts to one another, and they celebrate by giving donations to the poor. So this is a generational celebration that will keep the events of this victory in the minds of people for centuries to come. So now we are in, verse 27. So, because of Mordecai's letter and because of what they had experienced, the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition and pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. Remember, a lot of people became Jews because of what they saw, because when they saw Mordecai being lifted up, or because they saw the power of God behind the Jews, that they were able to accomplish this victory, many people turned to the Lord. And so here Mordecai is saying that this is going to be a tradition that we pass on, not just to the descendants of those born into the Jewish faith, but also the people who came to God because of it. So they declared they would never fail to celebrate these 2 prescribed days at the appointed time each year. These days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and cities of the empire. The festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what happened ever die out among their descendants. So, all of these things happened when Mordecai wrote everything down. But to back this up, Queen Esther is also going to take some authority, and she's going to write something. So verse 29, then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote another letter, putting the queen's full authority behind Mordecai's letter to establish the festival of Purim. Letters wishing peace and security were sent to all the Jews throughout the 127 provinces of Xerxes. And these letters established the festival of Purim, an annual celebration of these days at the appointed time, decreed by both Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther. The people decided to observe this festival just as they had decided for themselves and their descendants to establish the times of fasting and mourning. So the command of Esther confirmed the practices of Purim, and it was all written down in the records. Queen Esther, at this point, seems to be kind of coming into her own, doesn't she? She's grown up into really acting like the queen and decreeing that her people should celebrate this every year and backing up what Mordecai is saying with a royal declaration. It's great to see her come into her own as the queen. And the people realized that even as they prayed and fasted before this victory, now they can celebrate after the victory. So those two things always go in that order with all of us that believe in God. There's prayer and fasting, and then when there's deliverance, there's celebration. And that is the way that we learn to praise God for all the things that we see him doing in our lives. Now, verse 10 ends up the whole story. It says, King Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout the empire, even to the distant coastlands. His great achievements and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king promoted, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew became a prime minister with authority next to that of King Xerxes himself. He was very great among the Jews, who held him in high esteem, because he continued to work for the good of the people and to speak up for the welfare of all their descendants. It's great to think about the fact that Mordecai was highly thought of, and the reason he was highly thought of was not so much that he had power, but that he used his power for the good of the little people. Sometimes when people achieve a place of power and privilege, that goes to their head, and they begin caring more about themselves and about keeping their power and using their privilege than they do about why they were put in that position to begin with. And Mordecai did not do that. Mordecai maintained his interest in the people all through the time that he was actually second to the king himself. So he was really raised to a level of authority and power and privilege, and he did not misuse it. So that abuse of authority was not there in Mordecai. He wasn't corrupt like so many leaders were. He was still caring about the people. So as we come to the end now, it's time to kind of look back at Esther, for me it was anyway, and think about all the things I learned about her. First of all, I thought about the fact that she really stepped outside the cultural norms of women in that time. Women were supposed to be seen but not heard, subservient, take care of the family. They're not supposed to be involved in politics. And so Esther was able to break that cultural norm by using the gifts that she had. And one of the gifts she had was beauty and charm. And she didn't use it to seduce people or to get her own way like some of the people in the harem did. Remember when she was there? Everyone who met her, right from the first eunuch right straight through to the king, was not charmed as much by her beauty as they were by her character. So she had a wonderful character and a charm, and she used her character and her charm and her beauty for good, for the good of her people. Then we talked about how she had self-control. She didn't rush in and throw everything at King Xerxes' feet the very first time she saw him. She had tact and diplomacy, and she thought about things. She had careful planning. She had to have courage, but she also had to have careful planning. And when we rush in with just courage, we often make big mistakes. Courage without planning is not really very helpful. Courage with planning is what Esther showed. And in that same vein, she used her own gifts of hospitality to entertain the king and Haman, and those gifts were also used to further the plight of her people. So she was also very open and willing, open to advice. She took advice from Mordecai. She took advice from the eunuch that was in charge of the harem. She took advice from other maids and other Jews around. She was a person who was humble. You can tell that even when she approaches the king. If it be the king's wish, and if you find me willing, and if you're willing to do this. The same with Mordecai. She showed him a lot of humility when she listened to his advice. And then, of course, she had to be willing to act. And one of those key verses that makes that ability to act is on the fence. Is she going to do it? Is she not? And Mordecai in Esther 4:14 says to her, "Who knows if perhaps you were made a queen for such a time as this?" Such a great reminder to Esther. Listen to what I'm saying. God put you there for that reason. So that kind of turned the tide for Esther and made her willing to act. And she responds with another key verse. She says, "Go and gather all the Jews in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, and my maids and I will do the same. And then, although it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die." That is when her willingness to act became apparent, and her humility of asking God's blessing on this first was very apparent. But then her courage was, after we pray and we know God is with us, if I have to die, I gotta die. That's all there is to it. So she showed us some unbelievable self-sacrificing. She put the needs of her people ahead of her own needs. And that was so critical in this whole thing. Beyond all we learned about Esther, we definitely see God working behind the scenes in this story, and that God's plan and purposes will be achieved. Even though we don't see it and we see evil on the rise, God is in control, even when it doesn't look that way. And whatever your gifts, whatever gifts you have, like Esther had the gifts of charm and beauty and hospitality, whatever gifts you have, God can use those for his purposes to bring about unbelievable, awesome victories that we never expected or imagined. And that's really the point of Esther, the one book in the Bible where God is not mentioned, but God is on every page. So again, if you have ideas for where I might want to go next, or what you'd like to listen to, or what you'd like to learn about, or what you'd like to hear me talk about, I can only give you my thoughts. So I'd love to hear from any of you. I'd like to wish you God's blessings today, and know that I'm praying for each and every one of you. Bye-bye.